Evening. This is the lecture for Political Science 3400A, Public Administration on Horizontal Governance, dated March 25th, 2020. In today's class, we'll look at the various perspectives and principles of horizontal governance, the varied approaches for making governance work across departmental and jurisdictional boundaries. Depending on the relative formality or informality of horizontal governance processes, horizontal governance may also be known as network governance. We will look at the different approaches to horizontal governance that may be found in federal, provincial, local, and intergovernmental efforts, either to supplement or complement traditional, more hierarchical approaches to the design and implementation of various public policies and programs. We will look at some of the managerial and cultural challenges of pursuing effective horizontal governance within and between governments. And as we do so, we will look at some of the contemporary examples of the benefits and limitations of horizontal governance. First, different perspectives. Like many other areas of public administration, as Everett Lindquist notes in your text, there are both top-down and bottom-up approaches to horizontal or network governance, although it is possible to combine elements of both approaches. Top-down approaches emphasize the strategic and/or management objectives of central agencies and political leaders, both in encouraging cooperation among various components of a particular government and of economic or societal actors in order to achieve particular policy and program goals. Top-down approaches to governance emphasize the integration of cooperative measures among different departments or agencies of government. They frequently do this within traditional hierarchical concepts of bureaucratic government and accountability to cabinet and central agency. In intergovernmental relations, top-down approaches emphasize a lead role either for the federal government and subordinate or niche roles for provinces, or similar relations between provincial and local governments. Central administrations in municipal governments may also mandate cooperative measures across departments and agencies, whether independently or in response to provincial legislation, as in the field of emergency preparedness and management. Bottom-up approaches, by contrast, are generally initiated by leaders and staff of line departments and agencies across institutional boundaries, although they may be institutionalized or formalized over time. Such approaches emphasize the cooperation of participating agencies based on varying combinations of shared goals, objectives, and sometimes shared professional formation, mutual accommodation in the pursuit of these goals, and recognition of the separate spheres of responsibility and/or accountability to get different governments or constituencies. Bottom-up arrangements may be relatively informal, reflecting the collaboration of different organizations, whether within the same government or across governmental boundaries in cooperative networks of otherwise autonomous agencies. Cooperative networks may be entirely informal, involving exchanges of information and best practices across agencies, carrying out similar functions in different governments. Such practices may crystallize into or complement the activities of organizations of otherwise separate departments or agencies. Examples include the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, AUMA, or its counterparts in other provinces, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, and its counterpart, the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs. Getting police chiefs and fire chiefs to work together, however, can be a lot more difficult. Such organizations may share information on the evolution of best practices in different areas, as well as carrying out formal or informal advocacy towards other governments. However, they are rarely involved in formal policy development or the direct or shared delivery of programs or services. In a study done about 15 years ago, at least 20 distinct federal government agencies and departments maintained informal relations with counterparts in the United States. Some of these networks have become more formalized over time. Similar practices occur in interactions between and among officials with related responsibilities in federal and provincial governments. Institutionalized cross-border examples of cooperative governance include agencies such as the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, AAMVA, whose membership extends to provincial registrars of motor vehicles across Canada, or the American Association of Port Authorities, whose association includes major port authorities in Canada and sometimes members of ancillary groups like major service providers. Another example is the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, or PNWER, which has 23 working groups in different policy areas involving both public and private sector representation from 10 jurisdictions in Western Canada and Western and Northwestern United States. Next slide. Horizontal governance is a response to a fundamental political challenge, both within individual governments and in diverse federal systems, such as those of Canada and the United States. Many policy and/or administrative problems overlap the functions of different segments of government and orders or levels of government, as well as those of different governmental and non-governmental organizations within the same jurisdiction. At the same time, elected governments are legally and morally accountable to their respective legislatures and electorates, which do not take kindly to being set aside or taken for granted, as we've seen from periodic missteps during the current coronavirus pandemic. Government agencies, whether in the same or different jurisdictions, often face challenges of interdependence, which coexist uneasily with traditional government hierarchies. For example, after the 2003 SARS epidemic, the federal government recognized the need for a stronger public health capacity because of an administrative gap between provincial health departments and provincial officers of health and international health organizations. However, the provision of healthcare, protection of public health, and related public safety measures are predominantly the responsibility of sovereign provincial governments. Healthcare in Indigenous communities is the responsibility of a branch of Indigenous Services Canada, a federal department. But the majority of Indigenous peoples do not live on reserves, and others cycle back and forth depending on a mix of personal choices and circumstances. Processes are needed to ensure they get services they need without falling through the cracks. None of these actors are terribly responsive to top-down dictation. However, most are willing to work together in different settings, as long as such cooperation enables them to carry out their legal and practical responsibilities. The same thing goes for municipal governments and local medical authorities or other infrastructure providers, who are rarely within the same jurisdictions. Such realities contribute to the emergence of network governance systems based on different mixtures of cooperation and hierarchy, depending on the policy and service field in question. If interagency communication and informal cooperation are usually the first step in horizontal governance, the next step usually involves the development of memoranda of understanding, or MOUs, between participating governments. MOUs formalize certain aspects of intergovernmental relationships in ways that articulate a shared understanding of cooperation in legally non-binding manners. As a result, they do not require any formal legislative recognition. However, as written documents, they are useful for clarifying roles, as well as participating organizations' external requirements for accountability, so that institutional memory is preserved when there are changes in administrative leadership. Such relationships may be formalized in intergovernmental bodies, which provide a more or less egalitarian structure for information sharing, policy cooperation, and sometimes coordination among agencies, as discussed in previous classes on federalism and arm's-length institutions. Most federal provincial committees of ministers or policy-specific agencies fall into these categories. For example, there is a complex architecture of horizontal governance within the federal government on financial regulatory issues, along with separate federal, provincial, or interprovincial governments for dealing with the regulation of insurance, pensions, financial instruments, real estate, and other subsectors, most of which are in provincial jurisdiction. Over time, these groups may develop the capacity and political will to engage in joint policymaking, subject to the authorization of their respective governments. But they do not typically exercise authority separately from that of their respective governments in order to respect the sovereignty of parliament or legislatures within their respective jurisdictions. In Alberta, it's not uncommon to see a range of semi-formal arrangements for horizontal governance in various areas, whether in provincial or municipal governance. When I was carrying out research into emergency management policies and related activities in Alberta in recent years, it was fascinating to discover the range of ongoing local and regional activities aimed at the sharing and coordination of resources. These approaches balanced the exceptional decentralization in local governments in this province with the need for ongoing cooperation on issues which would frequently cross municipal boundaries, such as the impact of a major fire or flood. Examples include numerous regional partnerships among municipal agencies, government-sponsored partnerships for the monitoring of resource sector activities on local or regional environments, and processes for mitigating the effects of these processes through ongoing face-to-face interactions among community and industry representatives with provision for government intervention as necessary. In one central Alberta area of central Alberta south of Red Deer, an industry community partnership called the Sundre Petroleum Operators Group, or SPOG, has grown up over the years to manage these effects and increase the overall professionalism of industry responses to occasional incidents. In some cases, companies have been told by the predecessor of the current Alberta energy regulator to join the group in order to facilitate peer and community monitoring of their activities, given the largely reactive character of provincial enforcement. The province has encouraged the development of similar initiatives in other parts of Alberta. These initiatives typically complement provincial regulation rather than replacing it. By contrast, top-down provisions for horizontal governance reflect measures intended to project and facilitate the implementation of cabinet or central agency priorities across government departments or agencies of the same order of government, whether on a selective or whole of government basis. Lindquist refers to several such initiatives in your text, including a new results-oriented reporting infrastructure in the federal government, which was apparently reinvented by the Trudeau government before its abandonment during the past year. Horizontal strategic reviews of expenditures at different times during the 2000 and 2010 to deal with resource reallocation that we talked about in the class on budgeting, but also on deficit reduction. A Treasury Board database of significant horizontal initiatives based on quote unquote formal horizontal initiatives, and a Treasury Board measure to support the coordination of the regional activities of federal departments and agencies. In Alberta, we've seen a variety of horizontal governance initiatives in recent years. The province's emergency management framework for whole of government coordination has kicked in on several occasions, notably the 2013 Southern Alberta floods, forest fire emergencies in 2016 and 2019, and of course, the current 2020 pandemic. Although some observers have suggested that the modest differences in provincial responses to the pandemic warrant a top-down exercise in federal leadership, Ottawa's relative modesty in refraining from such an exercise probably reflects the fact that it has had to improvise the resources necessary to address areas within its own jurisdictions, let alone telling provincial health officers and provincial governments how to do the jobs in their jurisdictions. Given overarching bureaucratic cultures that typically emphasize conformity to central direction, Lindquist notes the importance of developing a training capacity for officials engaged in such activities while still conforming to internal accountability requirements. At the federal level, these activities are often carried out through the government's central training agency, the Canadian Centre for Management Development. At the provincial level, training and professionalization activities are often sector-specific. Next slide. Horizontal governance may provide advantages in certain settings, but it is definitely not a panacea, and it is generally subject to participants' willingness to cooperate in good faith. Horizontal or network governance projects are subject to unilateral defection by more powerful partners, either through imposing new conditions or reneging on previous agreements. For example, the Western Climate Initiative, which brought together 13 jurisdictions in Western Canada and the United States, fell apart after 2008, after most jurisdictions except BC and California bailed out for fiscal reasons. The more power in particular settings is centralized in ways described in our previous discussion of the new political governance, the less likely horizontal governance is to work, except as a collaboration of equals. Scholars suggest 5 key factors for the success of horizontal management initiatives. First, the effectiveness of informal network or partnership processes depends on the extent to which participants share goals, values, mutual trust, and often professional or technical formation. The development of these criteria and the related willingness to trust often takes time and can be reinforced by the anticipation of benefits from continuing collaboration. However, it does help if participants perceive one another as peers or formal and practical equals. Second, to the extent that such partnerships are formalized, they need to have relatively clear, simple rules and be transparent in their application. It is also helpful if there are periodic processes for evaluation and review of these processes so that they are seen to work for all or most partners. If participants don't see them as adding value to their own organizations, they are unlikely to continue. Next slide. Third, leadership is vital, including but not limited to support from senior political leadership and central agencies and the stability of group leadership functions. Frequent turnover of ministers or bureaucratic leadership is likely to undermine the workings of the group, especially as electoral cycles are not coordinated either within Canada or in cross-border relations. Internal or operational leadership is also important for building relationships and establishing the continuity of interaction that is vital to building and maintaining trust among participants. Fourth, structure matters. As noted above, it can depend heavily on a convergence of interests among key partners. Groups with similar functions and interests are more likely to work together. Groups which view one another as competitors for jurisdiction, for budgets, or other resources, or which are always looking over their shoulders as priorities shift within their larger government organizations, are unlikely to sustain effective cooperation. However, as in many aspects of both federal-provincial and Canada-US relations, some of these barriers can be overcome to some degree if the partner or partners who derive the greatest potential benefit from the collaboration are willing to supply the resources, including, in some cases, basic things like budgets for travel, necessary to make horizontal governance work. Finally, relative clarity, transparency, and consistency of rules governing the partnership are important. If there are legal or practical limits to horizontal governance, it's important that participants know that up front in order to manage expectations and focus participant shared priorities, the things they can or are willing to do, not the things they can't or won't. Horizontal cooperation is difficult to achieve and maintain if there is too much complexity, or participating groups have to adapt to changes in government-wide systems of administrative rules that leave little room for collaboration with outsiders. Horizontal governance is a varied and complex topic which could take an entire semester to cover in all its glorious detail. Hopefully, Hopefully, this outline will give you a few ideas of the potential and the conditions to make it work in practice. If participants have the necessary skill, flexibility, and patience. In our next class, we'll look at the question of performance management, why it's needed, and some of the challenges of making it work in government. Thanks very much, and have a good evening.